Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we take up the analysis of today's newspaper, I would like to inform you that on the 4th of July, we shall be holding another round of our National Scholarship Test. This online test begins at 11 a.m., and those who perform well will stand a chance to win attractive scholarships to our IAS courses. So, those who are interested, kindly register by using the link given below in the description box. With this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by Alka Acharya, an eminent professor of international relations and Chinese studies at the JNU. In this column, the writer examines the evolution of the Communist Party of China along with its ideological basis, and she examines the role the Chinese Communist Party has played in the rise of China towards global dominance. In the end, she also tries to answer the question whether the CPC has led China to become a success story or a success trap. This column has been published today, and we are discussing this important topic because the government of China, that is the PRC or the People's Republic of China, is celebrating the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the Communist Party of China. As you might know, China is a single party state. Today, China's political and economic rise is credited to the Communist Party of China, and the political and economic ideology of this party is rooted in communism. The political and economic philosophies of the CPC has been inspired by the principles of Marx, Lenin, and as well as Mao Zedong. Initially, China started out as a communist socialist economy, but gradually China has opened up and adopted a more mixed model. And through the embrace of capitalism and through the opening up of its economy via economic reforms, today China has clearly emerged as one of the most powerful economies in the world. But these political and economic principles that the CPC has adopted, they have all been customized to suit the Chinese context, and they have been imbibed with Chinese characteristics. Today, the political and economic success of China is credited to this unique model of communism that China adopted, which was championed by the Communist Party of China. The citizens of China credit China's success to three leaders, including Mao Zedong, who is believed to have helped China stand up and establish itself as a strong and stable political entity after decades of external humiliation. Then Deng Xiaoping is credited with making China economically rich by introducing economic reforms and by embracing the mixed model and by opening up China's economy to the capitalist structure. Then the current president, Xi Jinping, is credited with making China powerful at the global level, which has firmly established China's dominance both in global geopolitics and as well as in the global economy. The writer says that this success of the CPC is a result of the party's ability to learn from history and also because of its ability to quickly change course if required, which has allowed the CPC to evolve and grow stronger, leading to the eventual rise of the PRC as a powerful state. But this success story of the CPC also comes with a success trap. This rise of China led by the CPC is not free from controversies. And to understand that, we need to trace the brief history of the rise of China. See, the Chinese Communist Party was established in secret on the 23rd of July 1921, and it was founded by a group of revolutionaries which included Li Dezhou and Shen Duziu. Since then, the CCP has become a monopolistic party which has dominated China's political affairs. The story of CCP begins at the end of the First World War, when the political situation within China and as well as at the global level was very fluid. The Chinese people were unhappy, and with the then government, particularly after it failed to gain concessions from the Allied powers at the end of the war. The Chinese people were unhappy with the Treaty of Versailles and its terms, which had ended the World War. Because during the colonial imperial rule, Britain and France, they had humiliated China and its ancient civilization and culture, and thereby they had hurt Chinese pride. And the people were hoping that the then Chinese government would seek and extract concessions through the Treaty of Versailles from the colonial imperial powers. This dissatisfaction led to a series of anti imperialist uprisings through the May 4th movement, and in Beijing, thousands of students held mass demonstration as a retaliation to the government's response to the Treaty of Versailles. This movement triggered an upsurge in Chinese nationalism, and a group of revolutionaries under the leadership of Mao Zedong, they began charting the future political course of the country. And this group of revolutionaries, they drew inspiration from the Bolshevik Revolution of Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution, led by the Bolshevik Party, which was again inspired by communism, had overthrown the imperial government, and the philosophy of communism, which was championed by the Soviet Union's leader Vladimir Lenin, inspired Mao Zedong. Later in the 1920s, Mao Zedong would go on to become the chairman of the CCP, and he would lead the Communist Party during China's Civil War, which lasted from the 1920s till 1949. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, came to power in 1949 following the revolution at the end of the Chinese Civil War. After the Second World War ended with the defeat of Imperial Japan, a new political opportunity opened up for China, especially for the Chinese Communist Party. Because in the years leading up to the Second World War, Imperial Japan had caused massive atrocities in China, and the defeat of Japan and the end of the World War gave a new opportunity for the CCP. Then, parallelly, the CCP led by Mao Zedong was able to drive out the Kuomintang Party, which had led the Republic of China government, which claimed sovereignty over mainland China. And at the end of Chinese Civil War, this party was driven out to the small island of Taiwan, where we still have the Republic of China government to be governing Taiwan. With this, political power in mainland China fell into the hands of the CCP, and it managed to break the chain of the imperial system and the dominance that was held by the colonial powers. Then came the Great Leap Forward, which was essentially a man made famine and disaster that was set off by the policies of Mao Zedong. During this period, Mao Zedong was looking to rapidly industrialize China at great cost. But this plan hit a roadblock because the rate of agricultural food production wasn't high enough to allow the industrial workforce to expand further and to keep the workers fed. This led to a food security crisis in the country. But despite the disaster and the famine, millions of peasants were forced by the Chinese Communist Party to build backyard furnaces and help industrialization of China. And as a result, agriculture collapsed and many farmers lost their lives due to starvation. Reportedly, around 40 million people were killed during the Great Leap Forward. In the end, China did industrialize, but it came at great human cost. Then came the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, which was again championed by Mao Zedong. This Cultural Revolution was a result of Mao Zedong's attempt to get rid of his rivals in the government and to revive his image amongst the Chinese people. Because the Great Leap Forward had affected his credibility and image, so through the Cultural Revolution, he was looking to revive his image and the image of the party. This cultural revolution was aimed at casting away the four olds, including old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. This was an attempt by Mao Zedong to completely revamp China's entire belief system, and even many famous temples and traditional shrines were destroyed. Then, following the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, the Cultural Revolution came to an end, and the four top leaders of the Communist Party, known as the Gang of Four, who were close to Mao Zedong, they were arrested by the rivals. And with the arrest of the Gang of Four, this entire decade of chaos and destruction came to an end. This marked a major turning point for China as China started reforming itself and opening up its economy from 1978 onwards under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Through the 1970s and 1980s, China would open up its economy for economic reforms. And despite being a communist socialist state, it started promoting free markets. thereby embracing a customized version of capitalism and thereby opening up itself towards the global economy. Following this, China witnessed rapid economic growth through the 1990s and through early 2000, and this has enabled China today to firmly establish itself as one of the strongest global economies. Its massive economic rise over the last 3 to 4 decades has enabled China to significantly grow its political, diplomatic, and military power, thereby establishing China as a major global power as well. But this rapid rise of China was accompanied by over centralization and establishment of complete autocratic rule, where all forms of basic rights were suspended and violated. The military crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 represented the growing authoritativeness of the Chinese state under the Chinese Communist Party, and all forms of basic rights, including freedom of speech and expression, have been completely curbed in China in the name of establishing stability and order. So, while China has seen economic success, politically and socially, China has paid a heavy cost. And this is what makes the Chinese model of growth and governance a questionable model. Right now, the CCP, under its leader Xi Jinping, has started consolidating even more power in the hands of the leader. And in 2018, all the limits on presidential terms were abolished, clearly establishing the chairman of the party and the president of the country as the most powerful leader of the country. The abolition of presidential term limits allows President Xi Jinping to stay in office indefinitely, thereby further increasing centralization and authoritarianism in China. Today, the CCP claims to have a party membership of more than 95 million people, making it the second largest party after India's BJP, as per reports. And while the CCP has definitely played a role in keeping China united and in helping China grow and dominate the world, it has equally promoted authoritarianism and autocracy, and it has extracted China's growth at great political and social cost. So, the writer of this column points out how the Communist Party of China is guided today in its approach based on 5 lessons it has learned from history. The first major lesson was drawn from the colonial era. When colonial powers like Britain and France were exercising influence in China in the 19th century, they had carved and divided China following its defeat in the Opium Wars, and Chinese territories like Hong Kong fell under British administration. So, this was seen as external interference and humiliation by the Chinese people, as they saw this as great disrespect to their great civilization. The Western colonial powers, they heaped more humiliation on China through exploitative policies, which eventually led to the collapse of the Qin Empire in 1911. Then throughout 19th and 20th centuries, China was also humiliated by Imperial Japan, and Japan had even committed grave atrocities against the Chinese. And according to the writer, it is this external fights of China and the perceived sense of constant humiliation at the hands of outside powers which makes the CPC very aggressive in its approach. Today, if China is seen as an aggressive state, and if it has employed an aggressive form of diplomacy known as wolf warrior diplomacy, then it is a direct result of China's insecurities of the past. Its past defeats and humiliation is what forces the CPC to get so aggressive on every issue, and especially with regard to outside powers, its neighbors. China tends to get very aggressive with regard to any dispute and doesn't cede any ground, and even goes to the extent of justifying its unilateral claims, because through history it has come to believe that its interests, that is Chinese interests, could be protected only by resorting to aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy. This is what explains China's current aggression, its neighbors, and as well as against global powers. The second lesson for China came from the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 inspired the birth of communism in China, but the Communist Party quickly realized that any external concepts and philosophies, they will have to be first customized to suit the Chinese context and the Chinese circumstances by promoting Sinization. So even though the Communist Party did borrow philosophies and ideologies from the outside, it would always customize those policies to suit Chinese characteristics. And even today, China is seen to be following the same model. If you look at China's embrace of capitalism, and if you look at its adoption of free markets, you will notice that China has simply not borrowed the Western concepts, but instead it has customized them to suit the Chinese context. But one of the outcomes of rapid economic growth was the rising political centralization in the country, which led to violation of democratic rights, especially in the late 1980s. If Mao Zedong's era witnessed great destruction, both political and social destruction, Deng Xiaoping tried to repair this and tried to reform China in order to grow China's economy. While the reforms brought in economic growth, it also led to excessive political centralization, accompanied with rising inequality and rising government corruption. Then later, when students and activists took to the streets to protest, China started using massive force, that is, police and military force, to clamp down on any protests in the name of ensuring stability. So, one of the direct consequences of this political centralization led to the rise of an autocratic state where fundamental rights were openly curbed in the name of protecting stability and order. So, in 1989, when students led the Tiananmen Square protests, the Chinese state did not hesitate to use military force against protesting students, thereby marking the erosion of democratic and human rights in the country. Then the Communist Party also believes in establishing a strong party state, that is, a single party led state, following the lessons it learned after the end of the Second World War and after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Such external events have made the Communist Party strongly believe that single party rule is the only suited model for China, and in this name it continues to justify authoritarianism, even going to the extent of violating democratic fundamental rights. Then comes a series of developments of 1990s and early 2000s, which has led China to aspire towards being a great power. This has brought China into a direct competition with the United States, which had emerged as the sole superpower after the end of the Cold War and after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So the economic and military rise of China in the 1990s and early 2000s has placed China in direct competition with the United States, thereby triggering a new edition of the Cold War or a Cold War 2.0 between the two current superpowers of the world. The writer points out these historical experiences and lessons have pushed the Communist Party to adopt drastic changes in its course, and as a result of its blind focus on making China richer and stronger, it has not hesitated to curb democratic and fundamental rights and to be unnecessarily aggressive with other countries in its foreign policy and military doctrines. So the writer sums up by saying that China under the Communist Party is both a success story and as well as a success trap. On one hand, it has achieved tremendous economic success by lifting more than 800 million people out of poverty in just a couple of decades. This is definitely no small achievement. China has registered phenomenal growth and it has led the rise of the Asian economies. This, no doubt, gives China the space to dominate the world by exerting its diplomatic, military, and economic influence. But at the same time, it is even a success trap because China is a lesson about how not to grow a country. China's blind focus on growth and security has led the state to become an authoritative state, openly violating democratic and fundamental rights. And today, despite rapid economic growth, China happens to be one of the most unequal societies in the world. Then this rapid industrialization of China has come at great environmental cost, which is going to affect not just China's interests, but also the interests of the world, because the consequences of environmental destruction and climate change does not know the concept of national boundaries. China's lopsided policies has even led to gender imbalance in the country, and today even its aging population is not being given enough support, and these demographic problems are a direct result of its authoritative policies such as the one child policy which was in place until recently. So for countries that deal with China such as India, it's very important to learn the history, the evolution and the ideology of the Communist Party, which is at the very center of the power structure in China. Understanding its role in China's rise and as well as in China's problems and failures will give neighboring countries like India a unique advantage while dealing with the country. Next, on page number 7, The Hindu carries an interview with Montek Singh Ahluwalia, the former deputy chairman of the erstwhile Planning Commission, and as a senior civil servant in the finance ministry, he played a key role in the introduction of the 1991 LPG reforms. LPG reforms stands for liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which opened up the Indian economy. And this interview has been brought out to mark the 3 decades of LPG reforms in India. See, prior to 1991, under India's socialist economy, a state controlled economic model had been put in place. It was essentially a controlled economic system, which is often referred to as the License Raj era or the Inspector Raj era. Under this model, the state controlled the markets and all manners of production, and this control system had led to the chaining up of the private sector in the country. There was an over reliance on public sector units, many of which had turned inefficient and sick. And almost every aspect of the economy, including imports, exports, the flow of FDI, the foreign exchange rate, everything was state determined. As a result, there were severe import restrictions, which was crippling the Indian economy, even though many of these imports were essential for India's export oriented industries. The inflow of foreign direct investment was discouraged, and the forex market was tightly regulated by the government. As a result of all these restrictions, enterprise and innovation had been completely curbed in the Indian economy, and as a result, the entrepreneurial spirit of the private sector and the animalistic spirit of the markets had been completely chained up. Eventually, these policies pushed India into a massive economic crisis, and in 1991, India was facing a BOP crisis or a balance of payments crisis. India's forex reserves had almost dried up, and it only had enough forex reserves to sustain a few days of imports. At this crucial juncture, the PV Narasimha Rao government, with the backing of the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, introduced a complete paradigm shift in the Indian economy by pushing for LPG reforms. These reforms related to liberalization, privatization, and globalization led to the introduction of several changes in India's industrial policy and trade policy that eventually helped in removing all these restrictions. These reforms even led to changes in the financial sector and the forex markets, and even the public sector units were reformed, which unleashed the economic potential of the Indian economy. So, as a result of these reforms, India has registered massive growth in the last 3 decades at an average of 7% during the period 1992 to 2017. This phenomenal growth of India has helped the country to lift millions of people out of poverty, and just between 2004 and 2012, 140 million people have been lifted out of poverty. While these reforms did bring in great success to the Indian economy, it also has its share of shortcomings. As Montek Singh Ahluwalia points out, the reforms were never completed, and especially incomplete reforms in the financial sector, and as well as the lack of attention that has been paid to labor and land reforms, continues to constrain the Indian economy, and these are some urgent areas that requires immediate attention. He also points out that India hasn't done enough to the healthcare and the education sector despite registering massive GDP growth. Even today, our healthcare budget and the education budget is a very small percentage of our GDP. And unfortunately, even though the economy has grown at a faster rate, it hasn't led to a commensurate improvement in socio-economic welfare. Plus, the economic reforms, which unleashed the private sector, has led to enormous environmental degradation, and India's economic growth has come at the cost of the environment and as well as rising inequality in the society. While millions have been lifted out of poverty, the elite and the rich have grown, and the concentration of wealth has increased, thereby leaving behind a large section of the Indian society. While these shortcomings exist, India has definitely made a lot of progress in the last 3 decades, and hence he concludes by saying that the reforms were hugely successful, but still a lot remains to be done. Then he also shares his insights on increasing protectionism around the world, including in India. Over the last few years, most economies are getting protectionist, and in the name of protecting their domestic industries, they are raising their import tariffs and their import duties. See, before India introduced the LPG reforms, that is before 91-92, import duties in India stood at an average of 57.5%. Such high import duties had essentially curbed all imports. But thanks to the reforms and the opening up of the economy in a globalized world, India's average import tariffs fell to 8.9% by 2008. But in the last 5 to 6 years, global powers have been losing faith in multilateralism and in globalization, and each country is raising its tariffs and increasing protectionist measures in order to protect its domestic industry. Montek Singh Ahluwalia points out that this could be an alarming trend because this would push countries back towards the control system. Such protectionist tendencies are on the rise even in India, and hence he calls for suitable economic action, which will help in keeping our economies open and reaping the benefits of globalization while protecting our domestic industries. Under the same conversation, he also talks about the RCEP, or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a proposed free trade agreement involving several major economic powers from the Indo Pacific region or the Asia Pacific region. It includes the 10 Southeast Asian countries of the ASEAN grouping, along with major economies of the region like China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, etc. Until recently, India was also part of these negotiations. But last year, India has decided to quit the RCEP negotiations. In this context, he evaluates India's decisions and he points out the possible reasons behind India's decision to quit the RCEP. First, of course, India was worried about unfair trade practices of China, and India was worried that China would unfairly exploit its advantage in manufacturing to dump its goods at a cheaper rate on other markets like the Indian market. Then, of course, the Indian government was worried about the impact of such a free trade agreement on domestic industry and domestic agriculture. And due to significant pressure exerted by the domestic industry and farmers, the government decided to quit the RCEP itself. But however, Montek Singh Ahluwalia points out that such agreements are actually mutually beneficial despite the risks that they carry. Yes, if these agreements are not well negotiated, it could give an unfair advantage to certain stronger economies, and it could also put your domestic industries at risk. It could result in the flooding of cheaper imported products that could threaten your domestic produce. But however, India's decision to quit the RCEP prematurely goes against its diplomatic doctrine of updating and upgrading the Look East policy into the Act East policy. India's diplomatic embrace of Southeast Asian and East Asian countries won't be complete without fulfilling the economic embrace. These risks would also be accompanied with a lot of opportunities and benefits, including gaining access to the large markets of Southeast Asia and East Asia. This could have boosted Indian exports as well, and it could have opened up numerous opportunities for India in the services sector and as well as with regard to investments. After quitting the RCEP on these grounds, the Indian government is seen to be pursuing free trade agreements and preferential trade agreements through bilateral talks with US, European Union, UK and Australia. While these bilateral FTAs might be beneficial, it also carries the same risk. And more importantly, if India is making economic decisions based on geopolitical considerations, then it might lose out on the benefits offered by RCEP, and it might be subjected to greater risks through these bilateral FTAs. Because these bilateral FTAs we are pursuing with developed nations brings out the divide between the developed and the developing countries. In such FTA negotiations, developed nations like Australia, US and the others, they expect very strict standards of hygiene, enforcement and protection of intellectual property rights, environmental regulations, labor standards, and as well as very high standards of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. These higher standards expected by the developed countries may not be met by developing nations like India, and hence Montek Singh Ahluwalia calls upon the Indian government to reconsider joining the RCEP. Now let's take up an article from page number 8 that deals with the IDEA initiative that has been proposed by the Department of Agriculture. See, recently a task force of the Department of Agriculture brought out a consultation paper on a concept known as IDEA, which stands for Indian Digital Ecosystem of Agriculture. Under this initiative, the government is planning to introduce digital technology to agriculture and help out farmers through digital technology by introducing digitization and its benefits to farming. Under this model, an integrated national architecture has been planned, which will provide for an unified database that will contain all relevant data related to agriculture, farmers, digitized land records, etc. It also seeks to integrate all aspects of farming, right from production to harvesting to marketing. For this purpose, the government is also looking to tie up with large corporate entities such as Microsoft, Amazon, Patanjali, etc., who can leverage their technological edge to enable the digitization and corporatization of India's agriculture. The government believes that this initiative could bring enormous benefits to farmers and significantly increase their income, thereby leading to an overall transformation of Indian agriculture. But however, the government has invited feedback from all the stakeholders and representatives with regard to this consultation paper, and several farmers groups and farmer unions have responded and have expressed serious concerns about this initiative. Two of their main concerns is with regard to the digitization of agriculture and with regard to the corporatization of agriculture. One, they are worried about data safety and data protection of farmers' data and agriculture data, and whether such data would be obtained with the consent of farmers. Next, they're also equally worried about the increasing corporatization of India's agriculture and whether farmers' interests would be protected against these large multinational corporations. They've also expressed concerns about a possible digital divide that might emerge as Indian farmers and rural areas are unprepared for such large scale digitization. Now let's look at this article from page number 10. The Union Cabinet has cleared viability gap funding for BharatNet. BharatNet stands for Bharat Broadband Network. It's a government-owned telecom infrastructure provider set up by the Department of Telecommunication to extend high-speed broadband connectivity across India, especially to rural areas and remote areas. The BharatNet project is being executed on the PPP model or the public-private partnership model, and to fulfill the gap in public funding, the Union Cabinet has approved a viability gap funding support of up to 19,000 crore rupees for the BharatNet project. This project will extend to all inhabited villages, even beyond the Gram Panchayats in 16 states, and it is designed to provide better access to e-governance and e-services, including online education, telemedicine, skill development, e-commerce, etc., which the government is looking to offer in collaboration with the private sector. This project is designed to bridge the digital divide in the country by providing high-speed broadband connectivity to the unconnected areas. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: examine the role of Communist Party of China in the rise of China towards global dominance. The second question: evaluate India's 1991 liberalization reforms and the lessons it offers for today. So kindly write an answer for these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.